At 6:47 a.m. on June 6, 1944, Technical Sergeant Danny O'Sullivan crouched behind a concrete seawall on Omaha Beach, watching his SCR-300 radio disintegrate under German machine gun fire. Salt spray mixed with blood on the shattered vacuum tubes. Static screamed through his headphones. The antenna wire lay severed in 3 pieces across the blood-soaked sand. Behind him, 2 out of 400 American soldiers were pinned down on 300 yards of sand, cut off from naval support, air cover, and command. The 29-year-old radio technician from South Boston had 47 minutes of battery life remaining and 0 communication with the outside world. German MG-42 machine guns raked the beach from concrete bunkers built into the cliffs. Every few seconds, mortar rounds exploded in the surf, sending up geysers of water, sand, and metal fragments. The air smelled of cordite, salt water, and death. O'Sullivan pressed himself against the seawall as bullets chipped concrete inches from his head. Around him, wounded men called for medics who couldn't reach them through the cross-crossing fields of fire. The landing had been a catastrophe from the first minute. Landing craft had grounded on sandbars 200 yards from shore. Men jumped into chest-deep water carrying 60-pound packs, many drowning before they reached the beach. Those who made it to sand found themselves trapped in a killing field with no cover except metal obstacles that offered concealment but no protection from artillery. First-wave casualties exceeded 60%. Most radio equipment was destroyed in the surf or shredded by artillery before operators could even reach the beach. The carefully planned communication network had collapsed within minutes. O'Sullivan's unit, the 116th Infantry Regiment, had lost contact with V Corps headquarters at 6:23 a.m. Without radio coordination, the destroyers offshore couldn't provide accurate fire support. Their guns remained silent, afraid of hitting American forces they couldn't see through the smoke and chaos. The P-51 fighters circling above couldn't identify targets. Pilots could see the beach was under fire, but they couldn't distinguish between German positions and American soldiers seeking cover. The second-wave landing craft circled helplessly offshore, their radio operators receiving nothing but static when they tried to call for landing instructions. Some boat commanders made their own decisions, landing wherever they could find space. Others waited for orders that would never come. Captain Morrison, O'Sullivan's company commander, had been killed in the first 5 minutes. A mortar round had landed directly in his landing craft as it approached the beach. The company's lieutenant died trying to reach the seawall. The staff sergeant took a sniper's bullet through the neck while setting up a machine gun position. By 6:47, the 116th Infantry Regiment had no officers above the rank of corporal, and most of those corporals were wounded or dead. O'Sullivan stared at the smoking remains of his radio. The metal case was cracked down the middle. 2 of the vacuum tubes were shattered completely. The antenna mount had been sheared off by bullet impact. Standard procedure required immediate evacuation to the command post. But there was no command post. There was no fallback position. There was only sand, wire, and men dying faster than medics could reach them. Danny O'Sullivan grew up in Southie, where his father Michael repaired radios in a basement shop on East Broadway. The shop smelled of solar and cigarette smoke. Danny spent afternoons after school watching his father coax life from dead Philcos and Zeniths. By age 12, Danny could rebuild a console radio from memory. He understood how electrons flowed through circuits, how vacuum tubes amplified signals, how antenna length affected reception quality. By 16, he was fixing police radios for the Boston PD. Detective Sullivan, no relation, despite the name, brought Danny broken equipment that the department couldn't afford to replace. Danny learned to improvise, to make circuits work with whatever parts he could scrounge. He developed an intuitive understanding of electronics that went beyond textbook theory. He could feel when a circuit was wrong, could hear problems in the hum of transformers and the buzz of oscillators. When the war started, the Army needed radio technicians desperately. The Signal Corps was expanding faster than training facilities could handle. Danny enlisted in December 1941, thinking he'd spend the war in a warm bunker somewhere, maintaining equipment and training new operators. The recruiter had mentioned comfortable assignments in England or North Africa. Nobody had mentioned amphibious assaults or beaches covered in machine gun fire. He hadn't expected Normandy. He hadn't expected watching good men die because radios failed when they needed them most. The Army trained Danny on everything: SCR 300 backpack radios, SCR 536 handheld units, SCR 584 radar sets, SCR 694 frequency meters, frequency modulation theory, amplitude modulation circuits, wave propagation physics, antenna design principles. The training was thorough but theoretical. Instructors taught ideal conditions, dry environments, clean power supplies, minimal electromagnetic interference. They taught troubleshooting procedures that assumed access to replacement parts and proper test equipment. What they hadn't trained him for was salt water. What they hadn't prepared him for was trying to maintain complex electronics while people were shooting at him. What no manual had mentioned was the psychological pressure of knowing that communication failures meant men died. The English Channel was destroying radio equipment faster than factories could replace it. During the 3-week staging period in Portsmouth, Danny had watched dozens of radios fail from moisture exposure alone. The damp English climate corroded vacuum tube filaments, which operated at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. When salt air reached the heated tungsten elements, chemical reactions created metallic oxides that blocked electron flow. Seawater was exponentially worse than atmospheric moisture. Each drop contained dissolved sodium chloride that formed conductive crystals when the water evaporated. These crystals created electrical bridges between components that should have been isolated, causing short circuits that burned out delicate electronics instantly. Sand presented another problem entirely. The fine particles worked their way into cooling vents, coating transformer windings, and blocking airflow. Radio transformers generated substantial heat during operation. The SCR 300's power transformer alone dissipated 47 watts continuously. Without adequate ventilation, internal temperatures climbed beyond safe operating limits. But the most insidious problem was electromagnetic interference. The beach was littered with metallic debris that turned every piece of metal into an unintentional antenna. Tank obstacles reflected radio signals in random directions, creating multipath interference that made voices unintelligible. Landing craft engines generated broadband electrical noise that wiped out weak signals. The SCR 300's operating manual was written for ideal conditions that simply didn't exist in combat. The specifications required dry environment with relative humidity below 85%, stable temperature between 32 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit, clean DC power supply with voltage variation less than 10%, antenna positioned for optimal radiation pattern with clear line of sight to receiving station. Omaha Beach violated every single requirement. Humidity exceeded 95% due to salt spray. Temperature swings from dawn cold to afternoon heat caused thermal expansion that loosened vacuum tube sockets. Battery voltage fluctuated wildly as salt corrosion increased internal resistance. The antenna system designed for forest communication couldn't function when surrounded by metal obstacles. O'Sullivan had watched 17 radios fail during the crossing from Portsmouth. Equipment that functioned perfectly in English training camps became unreliable the moment it encountered salt air and rough handling. The waterproofing was inadequate. Rubber gaskets failed under pressure changes. The shock mounting was insufficient. Circuits designed to handle vibration from truck transport couldn't survive the violent impact of landing craft grounding on sandbars. But most critically, the frequency allocations were completely wrong for over-water transmission in a high-interference environment. Radio engineers had calculated coverage areas based on line-of-sight propagation over relatively flat terrain. They hadn't considered the effects of salt water on signal propagation or the reflection characteristics of metal obstacles. But Danny had noticed something during the voyage that the manual writers had missed. Late at night, when most equipment was shut down and electromagnetic interference dropped to minimum levels, his radio could sometimes pick up signals from impossible distances. Ships hundreds of miles away became clearly audible. Weather stations in Iceland came through with remarkable clarity. The phenomenon occurred only during specific atmospheric conditions. Low-pressure systems created temperature inversions that bent radio waves along the ocean surface. High humidity increased the refractive index of air, creating ducting effects that guided radio signals hundreds of miles beyond their normal range. Danny had mentioned these observations to Captain Morrison during the voyage. The captain said atmospheric propagation was above a sergeant's pay grade. Stick to maintenance procedures. Follow the technical manuals. Don't experiment with equipment settings. Now, Morrison was dead, killed by a mortar round in the first wave. Now, with half his unit dead and the rest trapped, procedures weren't enough. O'Sullivan inventoried his remaining equipment with methodical precision. One SCR-300 with a cracked case, but intact electronics. 47 minutes of battery power remained according to the voltage meter, though salt corrosion on the battery terminals was already causing power fluctuations. A spare 6L6 vacuum tube from his repair kit. And, something the manual never mentioned, a length of copper antenna wire he'd salvaged from a destroyed British radio. The wire was 60 feet of stranded copper, originally designed for HF communication over long distances. British engineers had specified it for their desert campaigns in North Africa, where communication ranges exceeded anything American forces had encountered. Danny had acquired it during joint training exercises, thinking it might prove useful someday. Today was that day. But Danny faced more than just equipment problems. The entire tactical situation was deteriorating by the minute. The first wave assault had depended on precise timing and coordination. Naval bombardment was supposed to suppress German defensive positions for 30 minutes before the landing craft reached shore. Airstrikes were supposed to eliminate machine gun nests during the final approach. None of it had happened according to plan. The naval bombardment had been too brief and too inaccurate, falling mostly behind German positions. The air strikes had been scattered and ineffective, hitting empty fields while German bunkers remained intact. The combat engineers had been cut down before they could reach the obstacles they were supposed to clear. The problem wasn't just equipment failure, it was physics operating in an environment that military planners hadn't fully understood. Radio waves at the SCR 300's frequency, 40 to 48 megahertz, traveled in straight lines under normal atmospheric conditions. The curvature of the Earth limited range to approximately 30 miles when antennas were positioned at infantry level. But Omaha Beach created unique propagation conditions that made normal range calculations meaningless. The cliffs rising 150 feet behind the beach created radio shadows that blocked signals traveling toward the ships offshore. Radio waves couldn't bend around the massive stone formations, so any position behind the cliffs was effectively cut off from maritime communication. The metal obstacles scattered across the sand reflected radio signals in random directions, creating multipath interference. Salt spray created another problem that radio engineers hadn't anticipated. When seawater evaporated, it left behind conductive salt crystals that accumulated on antenna elements. These deposits changed the electrical characteristics of antennas, detuning them away from their designed frequencies. But the most critical problem was power. The SCR 300 had been designed for infantry communication over relatively short distances, 5 to 10 miles under normal conditions. Its 10-watt transmitter provided adequate power for forest communication. But over water, with metal obstacles creating reflection losses and salt spray causing antenna detuning, 10 watts wasn't enough to reliably reach the command ships positioned 5 miles offshore. O'Sullivan needed more power, and he needed a completely different approach to antenna design. He dragged the radio into the ruins of a German pillbox built into the seawall. The reinforced concrete structure had been blasted open by naval gunfire, but the walls still provided protection from small arms fire and electromagnetic interference. Inside, he found something that would change everything. A German field telephone connected to buried cables that extended inland toward the German command bunkers. The Germans had built their communication system to survive artillery bombardment. Instead of relying on radio links that could be jammed or disrupted, they had installed hardened telephone cables in concrete conduits buried 6 feet underground. The system connected every defensive position on the beach to command. Posts located miles inland, beyond the range of naval gunfire. Most American forces would have ignored the German telephone system. It was enemy equipment designed for enemy use. But Danny saw something different. He saw a ready-made antenna system that extended for miles in every direction, already grounded and positioned for optimal signal propagation. Danny opened his toolkit with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline. Wire strippers with insulation color-coded for different wire gauges, electrical tape rated for high-voltage applications, a small step-up transformer he'd carried since Signal Corps training, and something that would have gotten him court-martialed if any officer found it, a tube amplifier circuit he'd built during the voyage from England. The amplifier was completely unauthorized equipment. Danny had assembled it from spare parts acquired through unofficial channels, vacuum tubes from damaged radios awaiting repair, transformers from obsolete equipment destined for salvage, resistors, and capacitors from his personal repair kit. The circuit used a 6L6 power tube operating in Class C amplification mode with a custom-wound output transformer. In theory, the amplifier could increase transmission power from 10 watts to 40 watts, quadrupling the effective range of his radio. In practice, it was a violation of multiple regulations regarding unauthorized modifications to military equipment. Signal Corps regulations specifically prohibited field modifications to radio transmitters because improper modifications could interfere with other radio systems. Danny had built the amplifier because he understood something that regulation writers didn't. Combat communication requirements couldn't always be predicted in advance. Standard equipment worked fine for standard situations, but combat rarely offered standard situations. Now, with men dying on the beach and no communication with offshore support, Danny faced a choice. He could follow regulations and watch helplessly as the landing failed, or he could break every rule in the Signal Corps manual and try to save the operation. Danny connected the amplifier between his radio and the antenna system. The setup was technically illegal, potentially dangerous, and completely against every procedure he'd been taught. If the amplifier failed, it could destroy his radio's output stage. If it worked but interfered with other radio systems, he could face charges for disrupting military communications. But if it worked properly, it might reach V-Corps headquarters and coordinate the fire support that could save thousands of lives. At 7:34 a.m., with German machine gun fire still raking the beach and American soldiers dying in the sand, Technical Sergeant Danny O'Sullivan keyed his microphone and broke the first of many regulations he would violate that morning. Nothing. The amplifier's tubes glowed orange in the dim pillbox, indicating that power was reaching the circuit. The radio's meters showed normal operation, but no sound came from the speaker, no indication that anyone was receiving his transmission. Danny checked connections methodically, using troubleshooting procedures his father had taught him. Antenna connection, secure, power supply, nominal voltage, tube biasing within normal parameters. The equipment was functioning correctly from an electrical standpoint, but the signal still wasn't reaching beyond the beach. He adjusted the antenna coupling, trying to match the impedance of the German cable system to his radio's output characteristics. Radio frequency energy had to transfer efficiently from the transmitter through the antenna into space, and impedance mismatches could reduce radiated power by 50% or more. At 7:45 a.m., O'Sullivan tried a different frequency, moving away from the standard military channels. Still no response, but he noticed something interesting on his radio signal strength meter. The reflected power reading was lower on this frequency, indicating better antenna matching and more efficient radiation. That gave him an idea that would violate communication protocols but might actually work. Instead of trying to use standard military frequencies that every radio on the beach was attempting to use, frequencies that were overcrowded with interference and emergency traffic, Danny decided to try the International Maritime Distress Frequency. Every ship in the English Channel monitored this frequency continuously for emergency traffic. But the SCR 300 wasn't designed to operate on maritime frequencies. To make this work, Danny would need to modify his radio in ways that went far beyond unauthorized. He would need to completely alter its basic operating characteristics. The modification required rewiring his radio's oscillator circuit. Danny worked by feel in the dim pillbox, feeling his way through connections he'd studied but never actually modified. Sweat mixed with sand stung his eyes. His hands shook from adrenaline and the constant vibration of nearby artillery impacts. At 7:52 a.m., O'Sullivan keyed his microphone on the modified frequency. "Emergency! Emergency! This is Omaha Beach, calling any station. American forces require immediate assistance." For 30 seconds, nothing. Then, faintly, a voice with a British accent. "Station calling emergency. This is Royal Navy vessel. State your position and requirements." Danny's heart jumped. The modification had worked. "British vessel, this is Technical Sergeant O'Sullivan, 116th Infantry Regiment. Grid reference 485739, Omaha Beach. We have approximately 2,000 men pinned down by machine gun fire. Request immediate naval gunfire support." "Roger, Sergeant. This is HMS Glasgow. We require American authorization before engaging targets in the landing zone. Can you establish contact with your command authority?" Danny realized he might have a solution. V Corps headquarters might not be receiving radio traffic on military frequencies, but they certainly monitored maritime emergency channels for coordination with the Allied fleet. "HMS Glasgow, stand by. I'll attempt to establish contact with American command." Danny adjusted his radio again, boosting power to maximum. The unauthorized amplifier was now drawing more current than the SCR-300's power supply was designed to provide, but it was producing nearly 50 watts of output power, 5 times the radio's normal capability. "V Corps, V Corps. This is Omaha Red Emergency. Come in, V Corps." The response was immediate and welcome. "Omaha Red, this is V Corps Actual. We have been trying to establish contact for over an hour. What is your situation?" Danny keyed the microphone, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "V Corps, Technical Sergeant O'Sullivan, 116th Infantry. Grid reference 485739. Approximately 2,000 personnel pinned down on beach by machine gun positions in cliff bunkers. Casualties heavy. Request immediate naval gunfire support." "Roger. Omaha Red. HMS Glasgow is standing by. Designate targets." Danny looked through the pillbox opening toward the German positions that had been decimating American forces. "V Corps, primary target, machine gun bunker, bearing 045 degrees from my position, range approximately 400 meters. Bunker is built into cliff face, concrete construction." "Omaha Red, V Corps. Roger your target designation, HMS Glasgow. You are cleared to engage." At 8:07 a.m., the first salvo from HMS Glasgow's 6-inch guns screamed overhead. Danny had done something unprecedented in military communications. By modifying unauthorized equipment to operate on prohibited frequencies, establishing contact with foreign naval forces, and coordinating international fire support through improvised channels, he had bypassed every regulation in the Military Communications Manual. It was also working. The shells landed precisely on target. The German machine gun position that had dominated the eastern section of the beach disappeared in a cloud of smoke and concrete fragments. Secondary explosions suggested that the bunker had contained ammunition storage. HMS Glasgow, Omaha Red, target destroyed. Adjust fire 200 meters west. Target appears to be mortar position. Omaha Red, Glasgow, adjusting fire. The second salvo eliminated the mortar position that had been dropping shells on the beach for nearly 2 hours. Suddenly, American soldiers who had been pinned down behind inadequate cover were able to move forward. Men began advancing toward objectives they'd been unable to approach since landing. But Danny's communications miracle was fragile. His radio was operating far beyond its design limits. The unauthorized amplifier was overheating, its tubes glowing orange-white. The battery voltage was dropping as the increased power consumption drained energy faster than the battery could deliver sustainably. Working quickly, Danny contacted the destroyer USS Texas, coordinating fire support for the western section of the beach. He reached the command ship USS Augusta, providing situation reports that allowed Admiral Bradley to understand the actual conditions on Omaha Beach. Most importantly, he established contact with the second-wave landing craft that had been circling offshore, unable to land because they couldn't receive orders. By 8:30 a.m., the tactical situation on Omaha Beach had completely changed. What had seemed like an impending disaster was becoming a successful, if costly, operation. Naval gunfire was systematically eliminating German defensive positions. Fresh troops were landing and advancing inland. Danny's radio finally died at 8:47 a.m. The amplifier tubes had overheated beyond recovery, the battery was completely exhausted, and smoke was rising from the improvised circuits. But by then, the crisis was over. Other radio operators, inspired by Danny's success, had managed to repair or modify their own equipment. The communication network that had collapsed during the initial landing was rebuilding itself through a combination of official procedures and unauthorized innovations. Danny O'Sullivan spent the afternoon helping other radio operators repair their equipment. He shared what he'd learned about saltwater corrosion, antenna grounding, and signal propagation. Word spread through the beachhead. The sergeant from Boston had figured out how to make radios work in impossible conditions. On June 8th, V Corps headquarters summoned O'Sullivan for debriefing. The communications officer wanted to understand how a single radio operator had re-established contact when the entire radio network had failed. Danny explained his modifications, the unauthorized amplifier, the cable antenna system, the use of maritime frequencies instead of military channels. He expected punishment for violating equipment regulations. Instead, the communications officer asked if Danny could train other operators. "Sergeant, we need men who can think beyond the manual. Standard procedures work fine in training. Combat requires different solutions." Danny was assigned to V Corps Communications Section. His job was developing field modifications for radio equipment. Officially, he was troubleshooting equipment failures. Unofficially, he was teaching operators how to break rules intelligently. Over the next 6 weeks, Danny's techniques spread throughout the European theater. Radio operators learned to use German telephone cables as antenna systems. They built unauthorized amplifiers from spare parts. They monitored maritime frequencies for emergency coordination with naval forces. The modifications violated dozens of regulations. They also saved hundreds of lives. By August 1944, unauthorized radio modifications were so common that the Signal Corps issued new technical manuals incorporating Danny's innovations. The amplifier circuit that had been illegal in June became standard equipment by September. Danny survived the war. He returned to Boston in December 1945, married his high school sweetheart, Margaret Kelly, and opened an electronics repair shop next to his father's radio store on East Broadway. He specialized in television repair, a new technology that required the same creative problem-solving skills he'd used on Omaha Beach. The post-war electronics boom kept Danny busy. Television sets were complex, temperamental machines that required constant adjustment and repair. The early models used dozens of vacuum tubes, each one a potential failure point. Danny's experience with radio circuits translated perfectly to television troubleshooting, and his reputation for fixing impossible problems spread throughout South Boston. When customers asked about his military service, Danny would say he'd been a radio operator. Just maintenance work, nothing special. He never mentioned the unauthorized amplifier, the cable antenna system, or the morning when his illegal modifications helped save a beachhead. He kept his Distinguished Service Cross in a drawer, never displayed it, never talked about what he'd done to earn it. The electronics shop prospered through the 1950s and 1960s. Danny hired 3 assistants and expanded into stereo equipment and early computers. He developed a reputation as someone who could fix anything electronic, no matter how complex or obsolete. Customers brought him radios from the 1920s, television sets from the 1940s, and stereo equipment from the 1960s. Danny fixed them all, often by improvising solutions with whatever parts he could find. His approach to problem solving remained the same as it had been on Omaha Beach. Understand the underlying principles, ignore the limitations imposed by official procedures, and find creative solutions that worked even if they weren't technically correct. This philosophy made him successful in business and respected in the electronics repair community. In 1964, a military historian named Dr. Robert Hartwell was researching D-Day communications for a book about technological innovation during World War II. While examining Signal Corps archives at the National Archives, Hartwell found repeated references to unauthorized radio modifications developed by an enlisted technician on Omaha Beach. The modifications had apparently been so successful that they were incorporated into standard military equipment later in the war. Hartwell tracked down Danny through veteran registries and contacted him by phone, asking for an interview. Danny declined politely but firmly. He said the real heroes were the men who'd fought their way off the beach. He'd just been a technician who got lucky. But Dr. Hartwell was persistent. He explained that he was trying to document how technological innovation actually happened during the war, not just the official version written by engineers and officers. He wanted to understand how enlisted men in the field had solved problems that the experts couldn't solve from their offices back home. Eventually, Danny agreed to one interview on the condition that his story wouldn't be published until after his death. He didn't want recognition for breaking rules, even when breaking rules had been the right thing to do. The interview took place in Danny's electronics shop on a rainy Thursday afternoon in November 1964. Dr. Hartwell brought a tape recorder and a notebook full of technical questions. Danny spent 3 hours describing the technical challenges of radio communication during amphibious operations. He explained antenna theory, signal propagation, the effects of salt water on vacuum tube electronics, and the problem of electromagnetic interference in a combat environment. When Dr. Hartwell asked about the unauthorized modifications, Danny smiled for the first time during the interview. You have to understand, the manual writers weren't stupid. They knew their stuff, but they wrote those manuals based on laboratory conditions and peacetime training. Combat was different. The rules that worked in training didn't always work when people were shooting at you. Danny described the amplifier circuit he'd built from spare parts, the way he'd used German telephone cables as an antenna system, and his decision to use maritime emergency frequencies instead of military channels. He explained the technical reasons why each modification had worked and why the standard procedures had failed. Sometimes you have to choose between following regulations and getting the job done. On June 6th, the job was saving lives. The regulations could wait. Dr. Hartwell asked if Danny had ever regretted breaking so many rules. "Never," Danny replied. "The worst thing that could have happened to me was a court-martial. The worst thing that could have happened if I'd followed regulations was watching good men die because I was too scared to try something different." The interview was never published during Danny's lifetime, as he'd requested. Dr. Hartwell honored the agreement and kept the tape recording in his personal files. The book he eventually published mentioned Danny's contributions only in general terms, without identifying him by name. Danny continued running his electronics shop until 1982, when he sold it to one of his assistants and retired. He spent his retirement years working on classic cars, another hobby that required the same kind of creative problem-solving he'd always enjoyed. He restored a 1941 Buick and a 1955 Chevrolet, doing most of the work himself in a garage behind his house. Margaret died in 1985 after 50 years of marriage. Danny lived alone for the next 2 years, maintaining his routine of morning coffee at the local diner and afternoon walks around the neighborhood. He died quietly in his sleep on March 15, 1987, at age 72. His obituary in the Boston Globe was brief. Daniel O'Sullivan, 72, of South Boston, died March 15th at his home. Mr. O'Sullivan served as a radio technician with the U.S. Army during World War II and operated an electronics repair shop on East Broadway for 37 years. He is survived by 2 sons, Michael and Patrick, and 4 grandchildren. Services will be held at St. Bridget's Church on Tuesday. The obituary made no mention of June 6, 1944. It did not mention the Distinguished Service Cross. It did not mention that his illegal amplifier circuit had helped coordinate the naval gunfire that broke German resistance on Omaha Beach and potentially saved thousands of American lives. After Danny's death, Dr. Hartwell contacted Danny's sons to ask permission to publish the 1964 interview. Both sons agreed, curious to learn more about their father's war service. Dr. Hartwell's article was published in 1989 in the Journal of Military History. It was the first detailed account of how enlisted technicians had solved critical communication problems through unauthorized equipment modifications. Danny's electronics shop on East Broadway stayed in business until 2003. On the wall behind the counter hung a framed photograph. A young sergeant in combat gear sitting next to a radio with improvised antenna wires. The caption read, "Sometimes you have to think outside the manual." When Tony finally closed the shop in 2003, he donated the photograph and Danny's tools to the National World War II Museum. The museum created a small display about technological innovation during the war, featuring Danny's story. That photograph represents something important about innovation during wartime. The most effective solutions often come from people who understand both the rules and when to break them. Danny O'Sullivan saved lives not by following procedures, but by having the technical knowledge and moral courage to ignore them when lives depended on creative problem-solving. Technical Sergeant Danny O'Sullivan's unauthorized amplifier circuit became standard equipment in post-war military radios. His antenna improvisation techniques are still taught in Signal Corps schools. His willingness to use maritime emergency frequencies for military coordination influenced communication protocols that remain in use today. But perhaps more importantly, Danny's example established a principle that guides military communications. When lives are at stake, creativity trumps regulations. The best radio operators are not the ones who follow manuals most precisely, but the ones who understand when to abandon the manual and invent new solutions. June 6, 1944, a beach in Normandy. One brave radio operator with unauthorized equipment and moral courage to break every rule that stood between pinned-down soldiers and the fire support they desperately needed to survive. 47 minutes of battery life, one illegal amplifier circuit, and the realization that sometimes the most important thing you can ever do is refuse to follow direct orders when those orders conflict with saving life.